This morning's reading is taken from Matthew, and it's chapter 14, and I'm reading verses 22 to 32. And we are discussing Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus said immediately to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and, beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed down to the boat, the wind died down. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Well, this morning we're going to take a look at the time in the first part of Jesus' ministry when he based himself in Galilee and had a day, well actually more of a night, on the water of the Sea of Galilee. I put a map of Galilee on the slide to help. Capernaum was where Jesus was living, and that's near the top of the map. Bethsaida, which is another place mentioned in one of the accounts of Jesus on the Sea of Galilee, is to the right of Capernaum at the top. Where Jesus fed the 5,000 is either on the middle of the left or the middle of the right, halfway down the Sea of Galilee. We're joining Jesus using our reading from Matthew 14. And this is a time when Jesus has just heard that his cousin John the Baptist had been cruelly beheaded on the orders of King Herod. Jesus would have known that John's time had come to an end, and that his own ministry was starting in earnest. But Jesus was close to John and probably saw him a lot when he was growing up. Mary, if you remember, even went to see John's mother when she was pregnant with Jesus, and Elizabeth was pregnant with John, who became the Baptist. Jesus and John were close family. Jesus had asked the disciples to take him to a quiet place on the hills surrounding the Sea of Galilee for a time alone, to mourn the death of John and to pray. But Jesus had been busy healing and teaching in the area, and people of the surrounding towns and villages had tracked him down, even come across the sea on boats to find him. So Jesus put first the people and then settled down for a day to teach them. Then, seeing that they had nothing to eat all day, he multiplied 5 loaves and 2 fish and fed the lot, 5,000 men, including women and children, we're told. Maybe 10,000 people. This was a taxing time for the disciples, who had been on a crowd control mission all day, I would have thought. And then food distribution from Jesus' hands to thousands of people, women and children. Then they collected the leftovers into 12 fishing baskets. Jesus now desperately needed some time alone with his Father, and so sent the disciples away. We're told that he made them get into the boat The Greek word used is very strong and means that he compelled the disciples to get into the boat. And then he dismissed the thousands of people who had listened to him all day and whom he had just fed. And then Jesus went up into the hills to mourn and to pray. What a fantastic and amazing time in the ministry of Jesus. A big learning time for the disciples trying to keep up. Yet Jesus was not only Son of God, but also a man. He needed time alone to recharge his batteries, to mourn his cousin John, to rest, to recover, to be in the presence of God his Father. Well, the disciples must have been exhausted after all the day's events, but now they had to row against the prevailing wind on the Sea of Galilee. You know, the Sea of Galilee is prone to winds blowing down from the surrounding hills, which are on both sides of the sea. And the waves can reach up to 3 meters in height. Now, this would be quite a challenge for the disciples in their small fishing boat. Yet Jesus had made them sail across the sea. He had sent them. And Jesus, of course, knew that the disciples were in no danger, because he knew that they had been chosen to build the future church. There was no way they were going to drown on the Sea of Galilee that day. The disciples, on the other hand, had no such future knowledge and simply knew that they were in the water, on the water, in the midst of a dangerous storm. Jesus, however, had them held safely, and yet they had no idea. By the time Jesus had finished praying, it was between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. In the Greek text, the fourth watch of the night, a first century Roman way of breaking up the hours of the night, was how that time was described. It's often translated as just before dawn. From this hilltop vantage point, Jesus could see the disciples rowing against the wind, being tossed about by the waves. The basis of the Greek word used is to torture. So the disciples were not having a pleasant time on the lake. It was as if the lake was torturing them. From his vantage point on the hills, Jesus could see the boat on the lake, and the disciples must have been rowing all night. So Jesus walked down the hill and onto the Sea of Galilee and headed out towards the boat. Imagine that. Just walking down the land and then stepping onto the water and carrying on as if it was no problem. When the disciples saw Jesus approaching the boat through the waves, he looked to them like a ghost or an apparition walking on the sea. Imagine it. The waves were throwing the boat around. The wind was howling. The disciples were exhausted and pulling on the oars to steady the boat. And out of nowhere, they see someone walking on the water. It's just not possible. It's very scary. They cried out in fear, we're told. The disciples must have looked at Jesus, and he must have looked different. For them to describe him as an apparition or a ghost, he must have been incomprehensibly different somehow. Jesus was not recognizable as Jesus at that moment. Maybe Jesus was shining bright white, just like when he had changed in appearance at the Transfiguration. He was certainly different in some way. Jesus then called out to the disciples, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." Now this is huge and deeply interesting, because the phrase translated "it is I" is ego eimi in Greek, and it means I am. It is the same phrase that Jesus uses in John's Gospel when he says, "I am the Good Shepherd," or "I am the bread of life." It was the phrase recognized by the religious leaders of Jesus' day as the Greek version of the name God had given to Moses as his own name. So God said to Moses, "My name is I am who I am." And that had come down through Jewish history, and they knew that when Jesus said, "I am the Good Shepherd," he was claiming that he was God, the Good Shepherd. I am. What is interesting from our text is that when Jesus does eventually get into the boat, all the disciples say to him, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The feeding of the 5,000, the comparison of this with God supplying Moses and the people of Israel in the wilderness with manna, with Jesus walking on the water, all of this had finally combined for the disciples and picked up on what he had said, what he had called out. Take courage. I am. Do not fear. That's how it directly translates. Take courage. I am. Do not fear. The disciples tossed about by the waves, yet Jesus, Son of God, stood on the waves, immovable. Remember, whatever the circumstances of your life, the living Jesus is stood immovable with you and is calling to you, take courage. I am God. Do not fear. Well, our passage from Matthew is not finished with yet, because Peter says to Jesus, who is stood rock solid on the waves, "Lord, if it is you, tell me to come to you on the water." To which Jesus replies, "Come." Peter uses a strong word for "come to you," which means command me. Command me to come to you on the water. So the reply of Jesus, "Come," is a direct command to Peter to get out of the boat and come towards him. Peter obeys, takes a step off the boat and begins to walk across the water to Jesus. Peter has really trusted Jesus and gathered up his courage and gone for it. Peter probably couldn't swim, because even though he was a fisherman, swimming was not something done in the first century, generally speaking, and there was generally great fear of big bodies of water because of drowning. Peter becomes overcome eventually by the wind and the waves. Literally, in the Greek, it says they were charging around him. The waves and the wind were charging around him. Peter began to sink and cries out, "Lord, save me." Matthew describes Jesus as immediately stretching out his hand and seizing Peter. The Greek here is strong and gives the impression of Jesus stretching out his hand and really grabbing Peter and pulling him up. Jesus is there and will stretch out his hand to hold us and to pull us up to life, to eternal life. If we ask, if we can come to him, Jesus will not let you sink into the waves of the storm raging around you. However, like Jesus said to Peter, he may have words with you for not fully trusting him, for lacking in confidence in him, for hesitating, for not being steadfast and trusting in the steps that he has set before you in your life. Jesus helps Peter back into the boat, and only then does the wind drop and the storm cease, and calm is there. Only then did the disciples fall down and worship Jesus as the Son of God. What a huge demonstration from Jesus that he is indeed the Son of the living God. Jesus can join us when we don't expect him, often in difficult times in our lives. Look how he joined these disciples on the Sea of Galilee. Remember how he joins them in the upper room after the crucifixion, when they just had no expectation that he was going to be there. It's all those times when he is suddenly there with us that we need to ask Jesus, if it is really him, can we come towards him? Can we come towards him? And when we suddenly lose it because of what is going on around us, Jesus will stretch out his hand to us and lift us up to life and help us to move to a place of peace and calm. Amen.